I'm Kori Schake at the IISS, and this is Sound Strategic. Today we are talking with Robert Ward, a new member of the IISS. He is both the Japan chair and the founding director of our GeoEconomics program. We talk about the disaster of Gorbachev's choice to make Russia an alcohol-dry country. We talk about the days when Japan was the future, whether Xi Jinping is one of the worst leaders China has ever had, whether China's growth is sustainable, and what a bifurcation of the globalized economy might do. And lastly, we talk about 16th century Spain and the tax implications for American hegemony. I hope you'll join us. I'm Kori Schake, the Deputy Director General of this magnificent institution, and this is Sound Strategic, our house podcast to showcase the extraordinary analytic richness of the IISS. And I'm extremely pleased that today we have new to our ball club, the great Robert Ward, who is both the Japan chair and the head of our new GeoEconomics program here at the IISS, part of our effort to become genuinely ambidextrous as national security experts. Robert's going to be responsible for training all of our reflexes to incorporate economic elements into our approaches, as well as designing a program, and we're going to talk about the kind of program he wants to design. He comes to us from the Economist Intelligence Unit, where he was the editorial director of a staff of 200 some, and doing extraordinarily good work there since 1997, where he actually started as a Japan analyst, if I'm not mistaken, after graduating from Cambridge with a degree in modern languages. Chart your path for us, Robert. How do you go from studying modern languages to becoming a Japan expert to becoming an editor of the finest publication in the world?
Well, thank you for that introduction, Kori. A pleasure and a privilege to be here. Very excited to be joining the IISS as well. My trajectory came via languages, I suppose. I'd always been interested in how other people, other cultures think. I started with French, like everybody does in this country. And then my father made me give up Latin, which I was very angry about, but he made me do German instead, and then, which actually was probably better in the long run, and then Russian. So always interested in abroad. I went and lived for a couple of years in Germany. I was lucky enough to be able to go to university briefly in the Soviet Union in the very cold winter of 1986.
Wow.
Just after Gorbachev.
What an interesting time to be there.
Very interesting time to be there. Gorbachev had just taken power. He just banned the sale of all alcohol in Russia as well. So quite a sort of difficult time in the evenings in long Russian winters.
Did the ban work? What were the effects of it?
The ban worked to make Gorbachev really unpopular.
Right.
So all the I was in a quite an important town, still is quite an important town called Voronezh, and all the bars in Voronezh were turned into ice cream parlors. So that's how you got your kicks with a nice ice cream. And of course, Russians, they found their way around the ban and made their own alcohol and so on, which created other problems.
Yeah.
So I think Gorbachev's impetus was right to try and improve Russian productivity, but obviously politically it was disastrous. So and then from then on, I thought, right, where's the future? And in the late 1980s, it was Japan. If you're under 40, you have no idea what I'm talking about when I say Japan. They're going to take over the world. And in a sense, it was the future, but not in the way I anticipated.
Huh.
It was the future in the sense of aging, large debt burden, deflation, zero interest rates, and so on. But obviously, at the time, late 1980s, I was lucky enough to catch the tail end of the bubble as well. So really seen the trajectory of Japan from bubble burst to what it is now.
So, bridging your work on Japan and your geoeconomics work, a fair amount of which I surmise might have to do with China's burgeoning role in the international order and what it means for more established powers. Do you see any useful parallels between Japan in the 1980s and China now? Or is there just too much that's different about their economic circumstances to make it a useful set of parallels?
Well, your question is one of the big sort of question marks over China. I mean, is it going to become like Japan was in the 1990s and early 2000s? You know, and in a sense, there are similarities. One is the debt burden in China, of course. It's over, I think, as a percentage of the economy, total debt's about 300% of the economy. That's very, very high for a country at China's level of development, very, very high indeed. So obviously quite a lot of worry about that in the longer term, not in the short term because the capital account's closed, but in the longer term, the impact of that, just as Japan had lots of debt in the 80s and 90s as well.
One of the things I learned from the economist Carmen Reinhardt is that once you get about 100% of GDP in debt, that you never really claw your way out.
Yes, it's like having a credit card that's sort of 3 times your salary, the outstanding balance. So clearly, it's difficult without significantly faster growth. And of course, Japan's not really in a position to deliver that, given that the population is now falling.
Yeah.
On China as well, China's aging. And China's got one of the fastest aging populations in the world. So obviously a huge population, but the one-child policy relaxation, that hasn't really worked. Unfortunately, it's not like you can just sort of switch on children, even if you sort of relax policies. That hasn't worked. Pretty much like all over East Asia, actually. This is a problem for South Korea, for Hong Kong, other places, Taiwan as well. So you've got the debt burden in common with Japan, the demography, the slowing of growth as well. So there are some similarities. Where I think it's slightly different, though, is that China does have more growth in it and is, I think, a sort of, at the moment, certainly a more dynamic economy. But I think the next decade for China is going to be really difficult, really challenging. I suspect more challenging than at any point since Deng Xiaoping started the Great Opening in the late 1970s, because all these internal problems.
And do you think that, to what extent is that difficulty aggravated by policy choices? The consolidation of power personally in Xi Jinping looks to be an outlier in how China had been governed for the last 40 or 50 years. The repression, the sort of Han ethno-nationalism, the real aggressiveness of the South China Sea. What it looks like to me is that China has activated very early in their grand plan the prospects for antibodies to prevent their further growth. Do you see any strategy that gets them around that?
It's a very good point, and I suspect that Xi Jinping is shaping up potentially to be one of the worst leaders China's had, certainly for a long time. One of the beauties about the collective leadership that was the case until Xi changed the rules a couple of years ago, was the sort of diffusion of responsibility if things go wrong. So
it's a nice point.
And just it sort of makes the system flexible, a bit more flexible. What Xi Jinping has done by making the whole system about him, of course, is build in a sort of a rigidity into the system, which is also brittleness ultimately. And now everything is about him, everything is about his survival. And I think that this is leading to some bad policy choices, for example, on economic reform. You need more SOE reform. The economy needs to depend less on debt. You need to restructure the financial sector. You need to think about ultimately opening the capital account, renminbi reform, all of that. But all of that is really, I think, being kicked into the long grass. And of course, given the other issues that we've talked about, like demography and debt and so on, this reform of the economy is really, really important. And if Xi Jinping doesn't do that, I think he's storing up problems for himself going forward.
Let's talk about the GeoEconomics program. I know you're just settling in to Arundel House, but give us some thoughts about the kinds of issues you would like to see the program take on in its shape, and also how are you straddling these dual responsibilities of leading scholarship on Japan issues in the Institute while also running one of its major research programs?
Yes, so quite a lot to do, all exciting actually, and I think full marks to IISS for getting these two programs going, the GeoEconomics program and the Japan program. I see the GeoEcon program as really key for helping us to understand the framework, if you like, for national power, security, statecraft, and so on. And I don't think you can do this without understanding economic drivers. If you'd
agree with that.
If you'd just give you a sort of illustration of that, Kori, if you were to ask someone from the CIA or one of the US security outfits, what was the big thing they got wrong in the 1980s? It wouldn't be not understanding Kremlinology, or it wouldn't be or miscounting the guns and bombs in the Soviet Union. It would be failing to understand that the Soviet Union was about to collapse economically.
Yeah.
And similarly with bits of Eastern Europe as well. So economics now absolutely critical for understanding I think pretty much everything. So as we talked about before, I see the GeoEconomics program as this sort of adrenaline shot into the IISS that will really sort of round out some of the great work that people are doing here already. I think just to quote the great historian Paul Kennedy, of which more later. He was talking about back in the 1980s about the need to understand a country's productive balances as well as its military balances. I think that's absolutely spot on. So what I want to bring to the IISS is this sort of, as I said, rounding out, understanding, for example, the big question about China: is Chinese growth sustainable? What if they have a hard landing? What would that do to their ability to fund their military? What would that do to Xi Jinping's view of his position? How might he get around that, and so on? I think thinking about geoeconomics, Paul Kennedy, as we'll talk about a little bit later, was one of the sort of fathers of this sort of geoeconomic view of the world. But I think if you think about just how the world's changed since the fall of the Soviet Union, the rise of China in particular, think of the speed with which that's happened. In the 1980s, I think China was about 1% of the global economy. Now it's just under a fifth. Absolutely staggering rise. Then, of course, the decline of the US in terms of importance from maybe 40% of the world economy at its peak down to about 25 at the moment. This has all happened within the space of sort of 30 years or so. This is really leading to tensions. It's leading to instability. I think it's triggered a sort of intellectual crisis, strategic crisis in the West. And one of the important things I think to think about with China, because a lot of the geoeconomics thinking does sort of converge on China, largely because it's a geoeconomic power, in my view, is the use of economic coercion to get what it wants. And this, I think we'll see more of as we go forward. The big difference, of course, between China and the Soviet Union is that China is completely embedded in the global economy. You may have China in your pocket if you have a Huawei phone, for example, so really intimately connected with it. And China is not afraid to use its economic leverage to get what it wants, to ensure that vast swathes of the world share its view of the world.
Yeah, so I think this simple refutation of the argument that the Chinese are brilliant 100-year time horizon strategists is the fact that 5 years from now, you're not going to have China in your pocket if you have an iPhone, whereas now you do have China in your pocket even if you have an iPhone. And so the bifurcation of supply chains and the bifurcation of digital universes strikes me as something, if I were the Chinese National Security Advisor, that's what would keep me up at night, even more than demography, even more than Xi Jinping bringing greater brittleness into the system. Because China's current behavior seems to me predicated on a belief that nobody has a non-China option. And as recently as 15 years ago, the countries of the West had non-China options, and they're likely, with Ericsson and Nokia on 5G, for example, my government's going to cough up $60 million to help 2 European tech companies get on their feet to compete with China. I think they're underestimating the potential for cooperative solutions among countries of shared values. What's your view?
So you've identified something that's really a trend that's really important that I think we want to delve deeper into with the GeoEconomics program, and that's sort of the fragmentation that's going on, whether it's political or whether it's economic, and the sort of bifurcation into different ecosystems that I think you've touched on. That's an absolutely critical part of the Sino-US disagreement at the moment. So on the surface, the Sino-US trade dispute is about soybeans and steel. Actually, it's about far more than that. It's about power. It's about who sets the rules going forward. But as part of this sort of clash, the world is sort of splitting into sort of Sino-centric parts and to Western-centric parts. Nowhere more so, and I think one of President Trump's pushes is he's actively pushing on this in the technology sphere. So you have 2 different sort of technological gardens, if you like. One, you have China, which is state-led, where there are no rules on privacy, where they have access to lots of data and so on. And then you have the Western one, which obviously has a different set of impetuses. And all the trends so far are to active splitting of that. And that, of course, it might make political sense if you're worried about Huawei and so on. But actually, for the global economy, it's incredibly bad news. It's like trying to sort of pull the financial sector, sort of a highly integrated financial sector apart, like we had in the great financial crash. We saw everything was connected. The world is still very, very connected. If you follow your iPhone around the world as it's been made, it'll go in all sorts of different directions, all sorts and crisscross specific umpteen times. So the world is really very integrated, and that has traditionally been a source of growth and economic sort of pushing things forward. I think that's really under threat now. So this Chinese US battle is about power, and this will persist.
But it's not a China-US battle solely, right? Because civil society groups in Europe are going to be just as upset about Uyghur detention camps as civil society in the United States is. In fact, maybe even more so. And so the challenge for keeping an integrated global economy is not just going to be keeping governments from doing rash, reckless things. The American Congress may be unique in its ability to do rash, reckless things, but it is not the only legislature in the world who, when the public says, wait a minute, why are they rounding up an ethnic minority and putting them in re-education camps? So governments may actually prove to try and be a brake on social pressure coming in the West, and possibly efforts by civil society to foment civil society pressure in China. We already see this with lawyers groups, with artists, none of whom have any of the kind of individual protections that people in the West can bravely take action domestically and have. So there are going to be enormous individual consequences, in particular for Chinese in this.
Absolutely, and sort of touches on another subject, which is how Western companies, when they're trying to interact with China, there's sort of access to Chinese market, for example, how they navigate this. On the one side, if you are a US company, you're going to have to navigate political issues with perhaps the US government not being terribly pleased that your biggest market's in China and all the things you have to do.
And it may prove unsustainable for Tim Cook to sanctimoniously say he won't give the American government access to messages, even with that they're going to build encryption so that the US government cannot, even with a warrant, have access to stuff that he gives the Chinese to in Apple products. Like, that space is going to collapse.
And also the fact that if you're a foreign company and you're doing business in China, the idea that you can avoid these moral choices about dealing with a highly repressive government that will force you into taking a view, either towing the line of the Chinese government or making a stand, as we've seen with these two sports entities recently, and then all these companies that have been trolled and attacked for sort of listing Taiwan as a company and so on. So a whole load of other sort of
or not listing Taiwan, right? Like there is no avoiding the political blowback for choice, whether it's pro-China or anti-China choices.
Exactly.
The space is just going to collapse.
Exactly, which is one of the things that always strikes me as a kind of egregious. If I was a shareholder in some of these companies, I would be wondering, what is their risk management? Why do they not? Why haven't they war gamed this? They're operating in one of the most repressive large markets that there is on the planet. All sorts of risks there. Why haven't they war gamed it? And when they are in the sort of sights of, when they have sort of fallen foul of how China views the world, then often they improvise, so they make it worse. So this idea of risk planning, this idea that IISS has of the companies need their foreign policy, I think absolutely spot on.
You and I and all of the Sound Strategic listeners missed the opportunity to pitch our political risk management services to Volkswagen, which built an enormous plant in Xinjiang and has the Chinese government suggesting that if Germans are going to complain about Chinese policies, then maybe China will complain about the reliability of German cars, which suggests to me that the Chinese government believes they can deal with these problems in isolation, as though nobody has experience of Volkswagen cars, but also who in Volkswagen didn't see this coming and didn't do the political risk management for these kinds of problems. So we have strayed very far from our usual conversation on this podcast, but that is entirely fitting since you are going to be taking over this podcast with my departure from the IISS, so you can structure it any way you want to. Please, though, Robert, give me as my closing Sound Strategic episode your sense of the conventional wisdom in your field that it has wrong.
Well, I mean, I'm thrilled to be going to be looking after the podcast. I'm not sure how I'm going to fill your shoes here, Kori, because you have blazed a trail here, and even before I joined IISS, I was glued to the podcast. So privileged to be able to do it.
Thank you, my friend.
Wish me luck.
I do wish you luck
in the venture. On what the conventional wisdom's got wrong. Well, I come from sort of an economist's background, and particularly since the great financial crash, economists have had a terrible rap, basically because they miss all the turning points and they get everything wrong. I'm not supposed to laugh.
Oh, sorry.
And I was looking at some quotes, and of course Harry Truman, his famous quote that he said, "Bring me a one-armed economist, because I can't be doing all this sort of."
I always thought it was Nixon. It was Truman?
Well, in my search, it had Truman came up, but
interesting. No, I'm sure you're right. I just didn't know.
So, and he had a point, because economists do like to hedge our bets. However, one of the reasons why economists often get things wrong, in my view, is because of anchoring. And it's a very human thing to do. So you look at the future, anchoring off what you know from the past. And we've all done it. I've done it as well. And you have this nice sort of straight line forecast. And my favourite example from the real world of this is from 1932, actually, when Lady Astor was talking to Stalin in Moscow. So that must have been an interesting conversation to have been part of. Fly on the Wall in 1932, and Stalin was asking about the sort of British establishment. He said, "What about that Churchill, 1932? What about that third Churchill?" And she said, "Oh, he's finished." So they didn't get on particularly well. Probably wishful thinking on Lady Astor's part.
Yes.
But a beautiful example of anchoring about, obviously Churchill's finest hour was yet to come, anchoring off the past to predict the future. And I think one of the what people often do, and you've touched on it today, Kori, is with China. This assumption that China is a sort of monolithic, long-term, has a 100-year, 200-year horizon trajectory for global domination, and everything will be on China's terms and so on. And we've talked about the issues that China's got with demography, debt. We've talked about the institutions and the sort of the brittleness of the system. I think that the global order is still up for grabs, and this is why we've got all this volatility and the sort of tectonic plates sort of mashing up against each other. But when I look at China, which obviously is the sort of biggest thing that's happened in the last 30 years, I look at a country that has many internal problems, doesn't quite know itself where it's going, and is improvising to a great extent as well. So I think that what I would pick would be China is going to take over the world, that narrative. And I would just push back a bit on that, and I think the actual outcome would be a bit more nuanced.
Excellent. I feel like that's a great anchor point for the start of a geoeconomics program. And what about your favorite book? This comes back to Paul Kennedy in some way.
It does, because for this podcast, I dusted off my Paul Kennedy, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers from 1987. And I've still got it. I've chucked away a lot of my books, but I've actually, for some reason, I kept that one. And I've still got it. When I was looking, just doing a bit of Googling, bizarrely, in 1988, it was up there in the New York Times non-fiction bestseller list with Trump's Art of the Deal. But obviously, Kennedy, he's one of the sort of, his was the first important articulation, I think, of new geoeconomics. And it came towards the end of the Cold War, just as sort of ideology was being overtaken by economics, and the political was being sort of shadowed by the economic, and so on. And what he did beautifully, I think, he sort of identified the interplay of economics and strategy. He warned of overstretch, and of course at the time he was viewed, particularly in the US government circles, being far too declinist. I think he got a lot of flack for that. And he advocated keeping the economy strong and finding that balance, that sort of sweet spot between guns and butter. He got things wrong in the book. He didn't spot that the Soviet Union was going to collapse, which for a geoeconomist...
The argument that 3% of GDP spent by the United States constituted imperial overstretch always seemed odd to me when it was at the historic low point after 1945.
Yes, I mean, so he got some things wrong that actually, in retrospect, you think they were pretty major things to get wrong. Like as you've just said, the other thing, of course, that Japan was going to take over the world, and the seeds of Japan's collapse were sort of sown already in the late 1980s. Its sort of demographic turn and all the debt, and the fact that bubbles don't continue. But I thought what he got right, he identified the rise of China. And its economic strategy, and that was ahead of its time. I think that was pretty.
I agree. I think
impressive.
It's a genuinely fabulous book.
Well, also I think, and fast forward now, the idea of imperial overstretch, and you're thinking, the idea, can the US keep up doing what it has been doing, given its relative decline, given that it's obviously still, streets ahead of other countries in many different ways, but there has been a relative decline. How do you manage that? The other thing I thought it was really interesting, the importance of political will. With 16th century Spain, I think it makes a very good point that it failed because the elite wouldn't tax themselves to sort of fund all their commitments. So I think at the moment, given that we talked just now about intellectual crisis, strategic crisis, there's a political will issue in the West as well.
Yeah.
I think that there is an incredible amount in Paul Kennedy's book that is still relevant today. And of course, it's got that wonderful sweep of history, and I do love a book with a big sweep. So 1500 to 2000, which seemed a long time away when the book was published, is a beautiful thing. So I would go with that one.
Excellent. And the last question, favorite data visualization.
So, because I've not been long at the IISS, and I'm sure my next podcast will be littered with IISS database, I have gone with some of the excellent work that the Economist is doing on data viz. And I've come up with this fine map of the political map of the US, relevant, of course, as we head into the great year of 2020 and towards the presidential election. And it's a map of the US that sort of maps concert ticket sales to the US political divide. And why I like this, there's three reasons why I like this. First, and I think all data viz should be this, it is beautiful.
Yes.
It is lovely to look at.
Mm-hmm.
And you find yourself going into this sort of world of concert music, and you've got country, folk, hip hop, R&B, rock, alternative pop, Latin, and so on. And the sort of clusters of where these tickets are being bought for these concerts all throughout the US. So first, it's beautiful. And then the second thing, which again all good data viz should be, it shines a new light on an issue. And this time, obviously, thinking about the link between concert ticket sales and political preference. I mean, that's not something that I'd thought of. Income, yes. Education, yes. But not sort of music.
Yeah, it's a fabulous metric.
And the third one, why I like this, is it tells me something surprising. Namely, that in the northeast and Midwest areas, where lots of swing voters, these are where the swing voters swung for Trump. And this is where hard-edged rock is particularly popular. So that was something that I thought I would cogitate over and just work out what that ultimately means. I do want to ask you, Kori, if you find yourself reflected in any of these music references. Maybe you'd rather not say.
Well, so actually, my native land of Northern California appears to have all of the above. So, I'm clearly reflected in this map. Robert Ward, thank you so much for talking with us today. Thank you for taking over this podcast. Thank you for liking it before you even came to this ball club. And most of all, thank you for all the intellectual excitement I know you are going to give the IISS. We're lucky to have you.
Thank you, Kori. As I said, really pleased to be here and can't wait to get going.